a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This is a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also an archaeologist, also from La Sierra University. Our guests today, as we talk about Jerusalem in the time of Jesus and the early Christians, are Dr. Bailey Gillespie and Dr. Kent Bramlett, both from La Sierra, both archaeologists, both with a good deal of acquaintance with Jerusalem. So let's talk about archaeology and the Bible and what we can learn. Maybe first of all, as we're looking at this picture, of course, familiar to people who have traveled to Israel, to Jerusalem, people who have wished they could travel to Jerusalem have seen this picture too, of the Western Wall. Let's think first of all, though, before we actually get into some of the archaeology and think about some of the artifacts, let's think first about some history. What sort of setting? We're talking about Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, what we call the Roman period, and we'll be talking about what we call the Byzantine period, the time of the early Christians. But what do we have historically that sets us up for this?
Well, it's bracketed by a number of periods. Obviously, the Persian period, we usually date it around 539 to 322 BC. Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon Empire, including Jerusalem, and then Cyrus permits the Jews in exile to come home. And of course, Nehemiah the prophet. That's a great story in the scripture.
It's a terrific story of rebuilding the wall in a very short time. Yeah. Probably not a real good rebuild, right, but nevertheless.
And his emphasis on prayer as they rebuilt the wall is a nice little addition there. In the Hellenistic period, which is the end of the Greek period, 332 to 141 BC, Alexander the Great, of course, the famous Greek general, conquers Jerusalem and Judea, and then in 332 and 141, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucids rule in Jerusalem.
Ptolemaic primarily located south in Egypt, Seleucids north in Syria.
Antioch.
So we have Jerusalem surrounded here.
Yes, and everybody always goes to Jerusalem, no matter whether they go north or south.
And the conflicts happen there for a long period, a long time.
Then the Hasmonean period, or the Maccabean period, in 141 to 37 BC. The dynasty begins there. Jerusalem begins to grow a bit, and then the Roman general Pompey captures Jerusalem in 63 BC, which really starts an early part of the Herodian period. And of course, Herod the Great and all of those wonderful things.
And all of the Herods.
And he restructures the second temple, Herod does, adds a retaining wall to make the platform big enough for the temple to be, this new temple that replaces the other one. Of course, this is a place where Jesus was crucified during the Herodian period as well.
Right. Certainly have those connections.
Then we have kind of the Roman period after the destruction of Jerusalem. Roman forces destroy it and demolish the second temple. In about 135, Jerusalem is rebuilt as a Roman city. In 324, we have kind of the Byzantine period there as a transition as things get towards the Byzantine, the Christian period. And the famous Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built right after that period begins. Then later, the Persians captured Jerusalem for a little bit, and then the Byzantine Christians recaptured Jerusalem. So we have a pretty busy time in Jerusalem all during this period.
Very much so. And the language of Byzantine, from Byzantium,
that's right.
what is now Istanbul. So that name has stuck with it, and archaeologists simply use the name Byzantine, but we sometimes have to define that. It's the early Christian period.
Well, the Byzantine period down in Israel and in the Middle East there is shorter than the one in Europe, because they were up in Europe a lot longer. So two different dates for the ending of the Byzantine period.
Okay, if we have here an image of Roman Jerusalem and the temple, talk to us about what we're seeing here.
Well, it's really just one possible reconstruction of what the temple looked like, but it is based quite closely on descriptions in the Talmud, the Jewish descriptions of the facade and some of the buildings surrounding the temple. This would be Herod's great construction, his great project when he rebuilt the temple. We still call it the Second Temple, even though it's practically the third or even the fourth.
Very much so.
And around the outside, you'd see the stoa, the kind of like the little shops, the stoa. That would be, some argue that that may be where the Pharisees were actually had a kind of a council chamber.
And the southern end was, the Sanhedrin moved there.
Right.
And when Paul came with the people that he was bringing into the temple, got into trouble, that would have been the area that he...
And what about Jesus
The money changers.
throwing out the money changers
right.
in those stoa, most
Yeah,
likely?
yeah.
Probably so. We have a map here of a contemporary map, really, and with perhaps a position of where the temple might have been at the time of Herod's temple, the time of Jesus. And on it, of course, are some of the things that are still on there, the Aliosk Mosque on the edge and the Dome of the Rock, which was built later. And then, so we have this platform that was built that stretched a lot bigger than the earlier platform that Herod expanded in order to build a beautiful temple.
And I think that first photo we looked at the Western Wall is from this side, looking right here.
Right.
And the stones are massive for that lower part of the construction. And then, of course, it's been built on top of and on top of and on top of over time. But this gives us an idea of the possible location.
There's some sources outside of Scripture that are interesting to give us some description about the temple was like. The article against Appian by Flavius Josephus describes, quotes Acadius, that a description about the temple as a square altar built up, heaped of stones, unhewn and unwrought. And the temple itself was a great edifice containing an altar and a lampstand, both made of gold. On these there's a light which is never extinguished, not a single statue or votive offering, no trace of a plant in the form of a sacred grove or the like. Quite a description of what the temple might have been like.
Really plain at this point.
Yeah.
One looks at it.
And we have some coins that have kind of a depiction of the temple on it. And from Titus' siege of Jerusalem, Tacitus describes the temple, saying it's built like a citadel with walls of its own. The very colonnades made a splendid defense. Within the enclosure is an ever-flowing spring.
Interesting.
Okay, now we're looking not at some reconstructions, but at some real stones. Okay.
Right. This is actually the street that paralleled the Temple Mount on the western side. So down at the base of the retaining wall, which Herod built, the western wall is part of that, we can see the street. And this street was flanked by shops. Actually, I think this is the foundations of one of these staircases that go up to the mount. But you can see in the Roman destruction in 70 AD that we have these massive wall blocks that have fallen down from the upper courses of the retaining wall. And you can see the damage that they incurred in the street when they hit. We're thinking tons. Of course, the largest stone in the western side of the plaza weighs, I've heard estimates, 450 tons up through 600 tons. There's some debate about how thick the stone is, but it's of tremendous dimensions. So you can imagine then the limestone being heated by the fire and the moisture, the rain that has penetrated into the limestone, heating into becoming steam and exploding, and then the Romans also pried off other blocks that would fall down.
So why are destructions, this is typical of destructions, why tear everything down? Why not reuse this building? Why don't the conquerors reuse buildings rather than destroy it? I mean, these archaeological mounds are made up of destruction after destruction after destruction. What is it about the ancients that seem to drive them to create something new rather than occupy what
Well,
was
often they did reuse stone, didn't they? I mean, they robbed stone to put into the next layer, but I think the Romans were so unhappy with the Jews that they didn't want to reuse anything. They just started from scratch after they covered it up. At least that's one possibility.
And certainly in the destruction of 135, when Hadrian destroyed it, he even renamed the city.
That's
Aelia
right.
had the capital. Wanted to completely remove the connections.
You use the word unhappy. Would you use a stronger word for this?
Yes, you could. All the strong words that
All
you
the
want
strong
to use.
words that we don't have to particularly say, but okay.
This is an interesting piece. Just on the corner behind us, if I turned around from that previous picture and look, they have a reconstruction of the actual cornerstone. The corner of the temple had a place for a trumpeter. And on that inscription it says, for the place of trumpeting. And two, we don't quite know what the rest of it is. But they would blow the shofar there when Sabbath would come. And so it was a very important place. And that stone corner piece fell off the top at the destruction in 70 AD and went right down on the corner. And it was sitting right there when they discovered it.
So,
well, here's a view of the Temple Mount from the west, near the southern southwest corner. And you can see just a little bit of the staircase which ascends It bends here at a right angle. And then you have the royal stoa. Some people would place it at the southern end itself or up a little bit, probably where Jesus chased out the money changers. But from the west, you can see several access portals, gates. Each one has a modern name. We don't usually refer to them by the ancient names. But this particular causeway or bridge is very interesting because the people living on the Western Hill, we'll see a reconstruction of their villa in just a minute, the people on the Western Hill, people who live up like that are usually wealthy, they didn't have to descend into the lower valley where all the common people lived and walked. They could go across on this causeway into the temple itself. And these were the priestly families. And you can see the temple then in the center there.
And the Mount of Olives behind it.
On the other hill.
Right.
We'll see a picture of that later.
Yes.
We will come closer to that one. So, but a great visual to imagine what the temple and the surrounding area looked like. And we'll also come back to these houses of the elite. Perhaps Sadducees, I'm not sure, but we will come back to those.
And here it is.
We come fairly quickly in a painting.
For those who've been to Jerusalem, this is one of 4 in the Bull Archaeological Museum. It's actually underground now, under the modern buildings. But this is one of the villas, and you can see how Roman it looks. The only difference from a Roman villa is that we don't have pagan depictions of pagan gods and motifs. It's all geometric, but you have the same panels that would be quite at home in Pompeii or in another Roman villa. And then it's looking out from the Western Hill. You can see a bit of the temple. And these are the families that were the priestly families in the time of Jesus. And you can see that they had it all right. They had no problem with Roman rule at this time.
So that sets up, or at least gives us some background as to who were happy with the Romans
Exactly.
and who really were opposed to them. And these people are benefiting from the Roman system, so why not? Let's keep it. A spectacular villa. In fact, the whole of this is now preserved. Is it the Wall Museum?
Yes.
And you can walk underground and you see
the
really
buildings.
very well restored
Right.
these various rooms.
And this is the view that they would have had, except now, of course, it's filled with graves. It's the largest graveyard in the world. And looking from the side of the hill over by, I think, the side of the Kidron Valley, over across to the Mount of Olives, a beautiful, beautiful hill right across the road. You see how close it is to the city. And Jesus would have come down that road somewhere into the temple on the triumphal entry.
Right. Something else fairly characteristic of that mountain called the Mount of Olives.
Right, we know the pathway that came down into the Kidron Valley and then ascended up the Mount of Olives. And at the bottom, the base of the Mount of Olives was a olive orchard, and this is one of the older trees. People like to think that maybe this was an olive tree from the time of Jesus. We know actually it's not quite that old. Titus and Vespasian probably cut down all of the olive trees during their siege of Jerusalem. But the stumps resprout, so they could have some connection. And this was probably where Jesus and his disciples, in this vicinity, where they spent the night before Jesus was arrested.
I think it's Josephus who says something about the trees all around Jerusalem, that they were cut down in order to provide something to string up the inhabitants of Jerusalem
That's
on,
right.
and crosses or whatever, impaling perhaps, but in any case, it was for murderous purposes.
That whole valley has the things you need to have an orchard. It has olive presses, it has wash places, it has pit places, it has caves for them to stay in because the dew is pretty heavy in Palestine, and so it was and there are a number of locations, so you can just visualize that whole side of the hill being covered perhaps with olive trees.
Of
Just
course,
across from them, the Gihon Springs, where they got the water from.
And of course, Gethsemane is simply the Greek form of Gat Shemen in Hebrew, which means oil press.
Of oil, right. Another important installation from the time of Jesus, from Roman times.
Yeah, this is the Pool of Salome right here. It's been rebuilt. This is the New Testament site. They've just excavated some big, larger portions of it, and obviously you can see the steps might have been going down into the pool. It's a large excavation that's just begun.
Yeah,
The story of whom shows up here?
Well, the blind man, clay in his eyes, he's told to go to the Pool of Siloam to wash out the clay and receive his sight. Interestingly, most people visit, or until recently have visited the Byzantine site just up the hill a ways. we knew this was here from early surveys in the late 1800s, but only recently it's been re-excavated. So you can stand on the steps that Jesus would have stood on.
So people who took all of their photographs at the other site
They have to
now
come
have
back
to come
now.
back,
That's
right?
right.
And visit. It's good. Another important New Testament site in Jerusalem.
Yeah, this is the Pool of Bethesda on the other side of the city. And you can see, this is the artifacts around the site. You can see a Crusader cross on one of those pillars down there. So the Crusaders obviously referenced this place. And there's some ancient Asclepions there, some kind of healing places. So the pool was considered to have a tradition of healing, and this is the Pool of Bethesda. The famous text in John 5 just about this place. Soon another feast came around and Jesus was back in Jerusalem. Near the sheep gate in Jerusalem there was a pool in Hebrew called Bethesda with 5 alcoves. Hundreds of sick people, blind, crippled, paralyzed, were in these alcoves. And one man had seen an invalid there for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him stretched out by the pool and knew how long he had been there, he said, "Do you want to get well?" And the sick man said, "Sir, when the water is stirred, don't they have anybody to put me in the pool by the time I get there? Somebody else is already in." Jesus said, "Get up, take your bedroll, start walking." The man was healed on the spot. He picked up his bedroll and walked off. I love this in the Message Bible.
It's a lively translation.
Very lively
isn't it?
translation, yeah.
And back to the pool.
Right. You know, the reference to 5 porticos or porches, it's usually translated as, baffled people. How can a pool have 5 porches? Because the pentagonal design hadn't really come into style yet. And it was only in the excavation of the site that they understood there were 2 rectangular pools side by side. So you'd have the porches around the 4 combined sides, and then one dividing the 2. So that's the 5th porch. And you can see here remnants of actually a Crusader period church, a Byzantine. This is actually Byzantine.
Yeah.
And the buttresses going down to the base where the pool bottom was on the one pool over here, straddling with legs like going down into these 2 pools. And then this would be the central part separating another pool on the other side. So it commemorated, of course, that miracle of Jesus.
It did. And we actually will come back to this when we talk about the Crusader and Islamic periods, because
Right.
this is such an important site and has left an important chapel that we will come back to think about. The famous Ecce Homo arch, Behold the Man. It's probably part of a Roman arch. Later Roman arch, actually. But it's built on the side of the temple where perhaps the Antonio fortress was, where Herod had his fortress there. And so the guards may have been there, and it is an honorific arch. Now, is this arch and these pavements, are they primarily from the late Roman period? But people argue that the real New Testament Jerusalem is down another few meters or something.
Yeah,
What's the
these are
latest?
probably Hadrianic, so
Right.
second century.
Second century, still Roman,
Right.
still illustrative.
And in the right place.
And in the right place.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense. In fact, I think most of what we call the Via Dolorosa is, one would really have to get down quite a bit below the ground level to get to
that
the
whole tradition dates only to the 1300s
Right.
with the Franciscans.
Right.
Then when you go down below, you see this large area. It looks like a courtyard. And often is pointed out some of the games that were impressed upon the concrete there, the stone. And that's kind of the game of the kings. And we often talk about the soldiers bartering for Jesus' robe. That may have been, somehow that game may have played a role in it. And there are a number of those on that floor. So it could very well have been the Praetorium area, or it could be an area where guards waited, or certainly where Romans have played a very common game that they knew about.
Again, located in the appropriate place, whether we're
Right.
talking a little bit of a later time or not.
This one's quite a ways down below the street,
Right.
but you probably need to go even lower.
One of my favorite maps comes from Madaba in Jordan, called the Madaba Map from St. George's Church, depicting, one can see up here, the holy city, and then Jerusalem, have here, and surrounded here in Roman style, but with this major cardo. But this is Byzantine, so we're talking a little bit later, we're talking 6th century?
Yes, at least. And this is part of a map on a floor, a large floor of a church, a St. George's Church in Madaba. And every place else has just little tiny buildings and things, but Jerusalem has this beautiful outline because it shows how special the city was. And the cardo that goes right down the center of the center of the street is often thought of as perhaps being put on top of a Roman road, or else at least it's Byzantine. And they always had a main cardo, the heart of the city, and the cross street. But some buildings there are particularly important.
The design, the layout of the old city of Jerusalem really goes back to Hadrian in his 135 rebuild. And you can see he built is a tower, a pillar that originally had Hadrian's statue on it. This is the area of the Damascus Gate, which in Arabic is still called the Bab al-Amud, Gate of the Pillar. So even though the pillar's been gone 1,500 years, it's still remembered. Then we have along the cardo then the steps coming up to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we have then it's called the new church, the Nea Apse over here, and then up the Temple Mount area over here. And so many of the landmarks we can actually identify on this map.
The earliest map, probably, that we have of the Holy Land, probably to guide pilgrims, maybe primarily as to how to get to Jerusalem. You have
And what buildings to see when you're there.
Exactly, exactly.
So the Nea Church, the new church on the other end. And so.
Right. In fact, I have heard that excavations along the cardo, at least spots where you can get to, were informed. In fact, the discovery of the Nea Church, the new church, was informed by, at least in part, by this map.
Right.
So it's important even for modern concerns. It's a terrific map, tells us a lot about not only Jerusalem, but of course the Holy Land. And then the real thing.
Yeah, we have a reconstruction there of part of it, of the cardo. You can see it dead ends into that wall right there. So if we could excavate the rest of it, the theory is that the street would go right on through the city there. So this is, of course, a beautiful reconstruction. You can see the typical kind of Byzantine Roman road where you have a pavement that's covered under a porch on both sides, the streets that are slightly curved so the water would run off, perhaps even a sewer system underneath. And then you can see barely that there were some bricks put in where maybe stores were there on that wall.
We mentioned briefly the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When Constantine legalized Christianity, his mother, Helena, came to the Holy Land to identify the principal sites associated with the story of Jesus. So the place of his birth in Bethlehem, the place of his death and crucifixion, burial, and resurrection in Jerusalem, and then another site on the Mount of Olives commemorating teachings and ascension.
And the ascension,
But this, then, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When Helena asked the locals where the events occurred, they said under Hadrian's temple, because Hadrian tried to obliterate those connections with Judaism and Christianity and build a Roman temple here.
Which would have had a dome much like that. They talk about that dome perhaps being the very place where the Temple of Jupiter might have been or something.
So the death, the burial of Jesus, at least for whom? For Orthodox, for Catholic. In fact, I think there are six denominations that work in this one church.
And unfortunately, they don't all get along. And so, since medieval times, the Muslim family has had the keys and opens up and closes and keeps order.
Peace.
Keeps peace, right.
And then a final shot here.
Yeah, this is the kind of the mausoleum that was built by, I believe, Mussolini. And it had to have fire not too many years ago, and they've had to kind of restructure like an orthodontist would a set of dentures. But it's in the middle of the rotunda, and people have a hard time visualizing this perhaps as the tomb of Jesus, because you don't get a sense that you're outside the wall, because now, of course, it's inside the wall. And you don't get a sense that there's a hill there of any kind, although you do climb up to the place where the cross was supposed to be. But all of the things that you need there are there. There was a garden, there was a huge cistern, there were tombs found there.
And it's the right kind. It's
the right kind.
The loculus style of tomb from the early first century. But they cut away. They isolated one tomb, Helena did, which is probably very arbitrary. But remnants of that complex still exist further in the hill.
Now, when tourists go, they're often shown the garden tomb, which is outside the wall, an alternative with a nice garden and so on. How would you evaluate the garden tomb versus the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as far as authenticity goes?
Well, the ambiance is very nice,
Yeah.
and probably
Right.
authentic.
There's a
Yeah.
beautiful
Garden
biblical
tomb.
garden there.
Right.
Right.
A rolling stone tomb.
Right.
But-
Again, a cistern, and again, a garden.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the tomb complex there dates to the Iron Age, Old Testament times, then modified in the later Byzantine period. So it's the wrong.
Straddles the-
Joseph of Arimathea is said to have had a new tomb. This area, the cemetery fits. But unfortunately, perhaps the garden tomb doesn't quite line up.
Right.
Okay, listen, we have a couple of minutes left. Larry, talk to us about something close to you, and then we'll take the time we have now. We may have to come back and look at some of these later.
Well, a little storage jar here and a stirrup jar that is something that people travel with so that they can, put their, tie it to the side of the horse or the camel or whatever, and other ceramic vessels as well as glass vessels here that are typical of the Roman and into the Byzantine period.
Bailey, what is in front of you here?
Well, this would be probably a cosmetic piece right here. And Roman glass always has this interesting patina because when it's buried, it interacts with the soil and you get a very beautiful patina on the glass. It would have probably been clear at the Bible times.
Right. These, of course, need that curation.
And then right in front of me are some Herodian lamps that with a little spatulated spout, the kind that maybe the 10 virgins might have used in the story in the New Testament. I'll let Kent move over to the next
Yeah, just
set of lamps.
contrast these Herodian lamps. So from Judea at the time of Jesus, no decoration. I mean, very nicely made. Compare it with contemporary Roman lamps. You have Dionysus, you have various scenes from Roman mythology, and of course that wasn't acceptable in, at least to Jerusalem families of conservative Jewish connection. So this is very illustrative of those cultural differences. If we look further over here, we see, well, some bronzes. Many of the bronzes don't survive because in ancient times they were melted down if they were damaged or captured and made into new vessels. Look at this Roman door knocker. I mean, that would be at home on anybody's a door.
A well-to-do.
A well-to-do.
This would be elite, right?
It would be, yes. But the lion head. Cooking pots. These are typical Roman period cooking pots. People made their meals in these cooking pots. The ribbing is very typical of Roman and slightly later.
You can see how
periods.
those have been used. The soot is on the bottom
Right,
still
right,
of the
right.
pots.
And you have the same ribbing on both of these.
Yeah.
And the glass, very delicate. Some of this, not so delicate, certainly the metal pieces.
This is interesting, isn't it? A little safety pin.
Right.
It's called a fibula.
Right.
Think of the Romans pinning their togas on with those, and of course other clothes.
Well, I want to thank you, Kent and Bailey and Larry, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. We hope the program has given you something to think about and has provided some food for the soul as well. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.